town. No need to wander around. I live in a nameless town. Blackout.
Hello, how's everyone doing today? So today's tutorial is going to be about making a very simple light bulb scene in Blender. They're a lot of fun to make, and they can look really, really good on any portfolio. They're very artistic, and they can be meaningful if you put a little more thought into them. But I'm going to use today's tutorial as an opportunity to introduce a lot of the more complicated features of Blender to beginners. So, the camera, the compositor, making realistic textures. We're going to be making a realistic metal texture. The glass node, which, the index of refraction and all that. So I'm going to try to walk you through and explain in depth, to the best of my knowledge, the tools that I use in Blender on a daily basis. So let's get started. We're going to take a look at the light bulb scene that I've created here. This is hopefully going to be the result of the tutorial. You can see that there are a couple of light bulbs. There's one really big in the front, and the rest are kind of blurred out due to depth of field. And you can see, notice a couple things. First of all, the realistic metal texture on the base of the bulb, the realistic glass texture, which, as it turns out, requires not only using a glass texture on the bulb itself, and the filament, the reflections inside, and it gives it this really cool bouncing light effect. And you can see there's some light bulbs, some lights dotted in the background. Those aren't very difficult to make either. But let's jump right in. So open up Blender, delete the default cube and the default lamp, and we're going to leave the camera because we're going to be using it. But let's start by making the light bulb. So generally when you're making something a little more complex than a light bulb, you use a reference image. But in this case, light bulbs are very, very simple. So I'm going to make one kind of like the tubular style you see in the picture in the at the beginning of the video. But you can make whatever kind of light bulb you want. The principle is going to be the same. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a circle to the scene. And this circle is going to be represent the body of our bulb. So to add an object to the scene, in this menu down here, you can just click Add. And we have a bunch of choices. Since what we're adding is a physical object, and it's not like a curve which represents something, or an empty which is nothing that shows up in a render, but it represents a position in the scene, we're going to be adding a mesh, and we're going to be adding a circle. So you'll notice in the bottom left over here, this menu has popped up. This is a context menu of sorts. If you do anything to this circle before, if you do anything to this circle, this context menu will immediately disappear. So if I move it, it's going to go away and give me another context menu. And even if I undo, I can't get that menu back. So we're going to be making some changes to this stuff in there. So you can add another circle, or you can use a keyboard shortcut. The keyboard shortcut to add something in Object View is Shift-A, and I use that a lot. So Shift-A, go to Mesh, and then add a circle. And now under Vertices, vertices look good. If you change the number of vertices, you'll see that the shape becomes more and more complex. So you can put that on 64 if you like. I'm actually going to give this a more polygonal, if that's a word, a more polygonal base. So I'm going to make this a decahedron with 10 sides. And I'm not going to add any fill type. But if you give it a triangle fan fill type, when you go into edit mode, it'll look like a triangle. The faces will all be triangles. And Ngon just makes it flat, and nothing leaves it empty. So now we're going to edit this circle, this light bulb base, and we're going to sort of pull the rest of the light bulb out of it. So the first thing we want to do is we want to look at it from the side. So we should only see a flat line. So on your number pad, hit 5 to go into orthographic view, and then hit 1 or 3 to get a side perspective. So you can look around and you can see things look a little flatter. This is called orthographic view. And when you're looking at an axis dead on, you can only see 2 axes, and you can only move in 2 axes. the other axis is not available, and that's very useful sometimes. So now we're going to edit this circle. So if you tab into edit mode, you'll see these little dots appear on the circle, and these are the vertices. You can grab one and move it around, and you can see how it changes the overall shape of the structure. But we're actually going to work with the entire, don't forget to save. We're actually going to work with all of the vertices, so hit A on your keyboard to select all of the vertices. So when you have a vertex selected, if you hit A, it unselects all the vertices, and then if you hit A again, it'll select all of them. So now we can move the whole thing around. So you can pop back into the side view with either 1 or 3, and now we're going to make the small base section. So to extend a shape, we do what's called extruding. So if you hit E, and now move your mouse around, you see you've pulled some faces out of this object. And if you hit any of the directional keys, it'll only move in that direction. So if you hit Z, it'll only move it in the Z direction. If you hit X, it'll only move it in the X. If you hit Y, you can't really see anything because we can't see in the Y direction because of orthographic view. So now that you've extruded something, just pull it up a little bit, and this is going to represent the base. And that's literally all we're going to be doing with the base here. But now we're going to add another circle, so Shift A and add a circle underneath. And this one we want to make more round, so give it 64 vertices, and now it's much rounder. And now hit 7 to go from the top, and scale it down so that the circle is circumscribing, if I use that word correctly, is circumscribing the polygon here. And maybe you make it even a little bit smaller than that, so it's not just touching. Okay, now pop back into your side view and raise the circle so that it's just about in the middle of this hexagonal thing we created before, this decahedral. So if you notice, the view is popping back and forth between me being able to see through the object and me being able to not see through the object. And what I'm doing is I'm hitting Z on my keyboard, and that switches me from solid view to wireframe. And if you hit Z, it'll switch you back and forth automatically. So now we're going to pull the light bulb out of this. So first thing you want to do is hit E to extrude again, and now Z, and just pull the fixture up. And pull it up to a height you're about happy with, and now we're going to make a sort of dome shape. You can add a sphere, or you can give it some more resolution and hit Z again, hit E, sorry, again to extrude, pull it up a little bit, and now scale it a tiny bit, hit E, Z again, and now hit S to scale one more time, E, Z, and now pull it up a little less. Now you can even pull this down more, and now you've got this nice rounded top to the LED. And this doesn't look great. So if you tab out of edit mode and hit Z to go back into your object view, and I'm going to show you how we're going to fix this problem. So first of all, on this right panel here, there's a bunch of options. We're going to ignore most of those for now, but translate allows you to move it around, rotate rotates it, and scales it, but those are all things you should be doing with keyboard shortcuts already. So R for rotate, S for scale, and G for grabbing and moving this. But we're going to click smooth shading, which gives this a little bit nicer of an appearance. And over here, if you pull out this properties panel, you'll see a little wrench. This is called the modifiers tab. When you add a bunch of preset modifiers, you change the shape according to some mathematical formula based on inputs that you put in. So for example, you can turn this shape into a wireframe by adding the wireframe modifier. And if we look into render view, it looks like a bird cage now. But we don't want that. The modifier that we want is the subdivision surface modifier, and that makes this look a lot smoother. So if we turn up the view, we can see that we're getting something that looks a lot smoother, a little more realistic. However, after looking at this, which is why we do these things, I think that this bottom here is a little bit too small. So tab back into edit mode, hit 5 and 1 to get back into your view, and now we're going to scale this entire thing up. So in this bottom row here, there's this little thing that says the vertex select, edge select, and face select. So right now we are selecting vertices one at a time, and we could technically select entire rows using just the vertices, but it's a lot easier if you click face select, and now we can select faces. So hold Alt or the Option key if you're using a Mac, and right click. Interesting. Oh, there we go. Okay. So hold Alt or Option, and what on earth just worked? Interesting. I'm confused, guys. I have no idea why this isn't working. It usually works. Suspicious. Okay. So I guess we're gonna go. Is my Alt key just not working? Okay, so for some reason this isn't working for me in face mode, which is annoying. It works up here, as you can see. If you hold Alt and select something, it'll try to select all of the connected faces that it thinks you want to select. But for some amazing reason, it's not working on the faces down here. So go to the vertices mode again, so vertex select, and hit Alt and click on one of the vertices, and you can see it highlights them all in this direction. And now hold Shift and click on the row below, and that'll highlight all of them, and now we can do whatever we want. So I'm going to scale this up along Z, just to make it thicker, and this looks a lot better. This looks a lot more like what we were seeing in the picture. And I may want to give this some depth, so I'm going to hit, if you look at the bottom view, I'm going to hit E to extrude, but I'm going to hit Escape so it doesn't move. And I'm going to scale this into the LED, like so. And now if we look from any angle, it's covered. So this could affect how we apply the subdivision surface modifier. Yeah, see that's unfortunate because it doesn't look very good. But we will see how it looks at the end. Okay, so now we've got the light bulb base here. We need to add the glass. So the way we're going to add the glass is essentially the exact same way as we added the base here. So hit 1 and then 5 on your number pad to switch back into the orthographic mode. And now Shift A, another circle. So Shift A, mesh, and then circle. And you can see it's off center because it's placing it where the 3D cursor is. Excuse me. And if you want it to be centered at this point here, just hit Option or Alt G, and it places it right in the center. Okay, so now tab into edit mode again, and drag this up so that it's within the base, and now scale it down so that it's a little bit smaller because we're gonna have the light bulb kind of bloom out of it. So now I hit E and then Z and pull this down, and scale it out just a tiny bit. Hit E and Z again, scale it out, and then keep doing this until you can make the shape of a light bulb. So once we get about halfway, we can start pulling this back in again. And sometimes this is one of those times where it might not look great on the first try. This does not look very good at all. What happens if we turn on the subdivision surface? Yeah, that looks pretty awful. If we scale it, oh, that looks a little better. Okay, so in this case it was just a simple scaling. So if yours looked as bad as mine, you can just scale it along the Z and slide it back up into the base. And now we've got ourselves a bulb. And don't forget in the panel on this left side to check off smooth shading. And this is looking alright. Obviously, if you spend a little more time than I am spending on this right now, it's going to turn out much better, like the original render you saw. But this is just going to depend on how much time you pour into making this look good. So the next thing we're going to do is make the filament. So If you saw at the beginning of the video, the filament inside the bulb looked really cool. It was like this neat spiral, and it had all these like branching reflections coming out of it. And turns out there's a nice little Blender add-on that makes spirals for you. So the way you're going to add this add-on, because it's not installed default, you're just going to go to, in this top tab up here, click on File, User Preferences, and it opens up this new window. Click on the Add-ons tab, and search for extra objects. And you want to check off both Add Curve and Add Mesh for extra objects. Save your user settings. And now, when you go back into your 3D view and you hit Shift A to add something, you'll notice that there's a bunch of extra settings down here, including extras. And if we poke around, we might find something that looks like spirals. And playing around with those is going to let us get a really good filament. So let's start working on this filament. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to Shift A, curve, and curve spirals, and start by adding a spheric one. So this looks, this is just basic. Remember, we're going to be editing some of its properties in this context menu here. So don't click out of it. Don't try to move it. But let's edit some settings first. So first thing we want to edit is the number of turns. That's too many, but a filament generally has a few turns. So about 5 turns should be fine. Maybe 4 if you're feeling conservative. And now you can see that these steps are pretty visible. So these edges, and we want to turn up the resolution of these edges. So that's this setting here. Steps turns up the resolution, and the more you turn it up, the more it's going to take your computer to render. So I find a good balance is around 75. It's pretty hard to tell that there are edges there, and it's definitely going to be impossible to tell in the render. So the next thing we're going to do to create the filament is we're going to rotate this so it actually looks like a filament from our point of view. So just hit R to rotate, and we want to rotate it around the Y-axis, and then type 90, and it rotates it a perfect 90 degrees. So now we got this filament, and I want to expand it along the X-axis. So hit S, and then X, and stretch it out a little bit. And that looks pretty good. So now we're going to add the filament legs, and we're going to be actually pretty much done with the filaments until we get to like the texturing portion. So hit Shift A, and then add a cylinder. The legs are going to be super simple. So we're going to make these we're going to make these legs look like they're coming out from just a point down here. That'll be buried within the base, and they're going to connect to these two ends. And it's just a simple stretching out a cylinder and trying to vaguely fit it into place. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to make this a lot smaller, and so that's hit S and then scale it down with the mouse, and now we're going to stretch it out vertically. So hit S and then Z, stretch it out this way, and keep doing this until you've got something that's reasonably small and reasonably long. Now, hit 5 on your number pad to go into orthographic view, and rotate this along the Y-axis until, and move it around with these arrows here, until what we want is you want to use this middle bar, this blue line here, which is the Z-axis, as a reference, and you want this cylinder, the top portion here, to kind of touch the edge here, and you want this bottom portion here to almost be touching the Z. Now, if we look around, that looks pretty good. So duplicate it, and now rotate along the Y-axis until you get this nice X, and just move it over. And there you have your filament legs. Rotate it until you're satisfied. And those are your filament legs. They're probably the least important part of the render, but you know, if someone wants to just really zoom into your render, it's a good thing to have. Okay, so one last thing. We need this filament to have some sort of depth. So we're going to add another modifier to it. So click Add Modifier, and not add modifier, I apologize. Normally I would add like a skin modifier, but I forgot this is a curve. So we're going to go into the curve properties. So this panel here has properties for everything. So these are the properties for the render, these are the properties for the scene layout, these are the properties for the, no, this is the properties of the scene, this is the properties of the render layers, this is the properties of the world, the object, etc., etc. But we're interested in the properties of the curve, and this is a a very important panel. It allows us to change a lot of things about the curve. And then what we're interested in changing right now is how thick this is. So right now, if we render it, we see nothing in between these two poles here. And by the way, I'm going into render view by hitting Shift and then Z at the same time. And that pops me into rendered view. And to get out, I just hit Z. So what we're going to do is we're going to give it some depth under this bevel tab. So depth increases the thickness. And resolution makes it just a little more visible and less broken. And now we can see something in between the lines there. And you can turn this depth up to whatever you want. Make sure it's visible because it's going to be a very important part of the light bulb. So I want to move this into the light bulb over here, but there's a slight problem. If I could just click them all and move them around, but what if I accidentally let go? Then I have to click them all again. So we're going to attach all three of these objects to what's called a parent empty, and we're going to make it so that if we move the empty, these three objects move with it. This is a very, very useful tool to use if you have a big scene that has a lot of parts and you want to move them all at the same time while retaining their orientation. This is a very nice trick. So first thing you want to do is Shift A and add an empty. So go down to empty and add a plane axis. And this does not show up in the render, but we can scale it and move it around like anything else. And it's about the center of this filament and filament legs, which is what we want. So now right-click on all three objects, and then right-click on the empty. And now hit Control P or Command P, and set parent to objects. So now if we right-click only on the empty and we move it around with G, we can see that the filament and the filament legs follow. And this is recording. And if we rotate it, the same thing happens. And if we scale it, the same thing happens. So this is going to make mixing it in the first layer much easier. So hit A to select twice to select everything in your scene, and now hit Move M to move it to a different render layer. And I suppose I may have forgotten to explain to you that I was working in a different layer. So initially, I was working in one layer to model the bulb, but then I switched to another layer using these buttons at the bottom here. I'm really sorry. This just kind of defaults for me. Instinctive, I guess. So these are all layers, and if you use the numbers on top of your keyboard, you can switch to different layers. So I'm just hitting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. And we're in layer 2 right now to make this, but in order to move it back into layer 1, we hit M, and then we click on the layer we want to move it to. And now it vanishes from this one, but if we go to layer 1, we see it in there. Okay, so now we want to put the filament inside of the bulb. So hit 5 to go to orthographic view, hit 1 so you can only move it in the X and Y and the X and Z direction. And now hit Z so you can see inside the bulb. And hit R and then Y to rotate it the way a normal filament would be oriented. And now scale it down until it is approximately where you want it in the bulb. So I'm going to make this longer along the Z so that it fills up more of the bulb. And when we make that glass, it's going to be very nice. And I'm pretty happy with the way this looks. And it's not sticking out or anything. So that looks good. Okay. Awesome. We've got a nice little light bulb here. We're not going to texture it yet. We're just going to add one more element to the scene. We're going to add a little wire that runs on top. And the way we're going to add this wire is a Bezier curve. So Bezier curves are great. They're these little curves with these like little handles attached to them. And if you move the handles, they make the curve follow them perfectly smoothly, which is very cool and very useful. So it's easier to explain. It's easier to show you than to explain. So in order to add the curve, hit Shift A and go up to Curve and add a Bezier curve. And now it's kind of hidden in our bulb, but if you pull it up, you can see we've got this little curve here. Now let's scale it up. And we're not going to be doing too much to it, but hit RZ and then 180 to rotate it around. And if you go into Tab, you can see there's these giant handles. And if you click on the middle vertex there and move it around, you can see the curve perfectly follows it in sort of this ansatz format. And if we hit R on the vertex, we can change the rotation of the curve. So I'm going to leave it, maybe I'm going to rotate it a little bit to straighten it out. But I'm going to move the curve so that it is essentially sitting on top of the bulb. And I'm going to move it down so that the bulb is basically touching it. And now I'm going to move this along. There we go. And now I'm going to give it some depth, the same way we did before. But in this case, you see where it says fill half, check off fill full, and now increase the thickness of this wire. And this is going to be the cable that the light bulb is hanging from. If you had left it at full half, it would have only filled in half of the curve. But since we've put it on full, it looks a lot better. And you want to increase the resolution a little bit to make it a little more circular, else it just looks kind of garbage and like square-ish. Alright, so now we've got a wire, we've got a bulb. You can move the bulb along the wire. So to select everything in this area except for this thing, say hit B, and now you've got this crosshairs, and if you drag it across and make sure not to touch the wire, you can see that everything is selected. And I'm going to move this further along the wire. Nice. Yes, okay. And now I'm going to position my camera. Let me make this a little smaller. Okay, so now to position the camera, kind of use the viewport to get to where you want the view to be. I kind of want it like this. And now hit Control, Alt, and 0 on the number pad to put the camera in that same view. So this is not exactly what I was looking for. So I'm going to show you a neat trick to move around like you would in a video game and place the camera using that. So if you hit Shift F, you'll notice a little crosshairs appears at the center of your window, and if you move your mouse around, you see the camera pans with you. And if you use the WASD keys, you can move around like you would in a video game. So I'm going to move around until this is about in the third of the image. I'm trying to use the rule of thirds here, and if you don't know what that is, it basically states that images that have the subject on thirds of the image instead of on like in the exact middle or on the edges just says that it just shows that those images are more aesthetically pleasing. And the way you can show this is if you go to the camera settings over here in the properties tab and go down to composition guides, you can see it says a little rule of thirds, and just check that off, and you want your bulb to rest kind of nicely on it. And now I'm going to move this wire in the X direction so that it's just off the image. I'm going to use the B tool again to select and put this bulb here. I'm going to rotate it a little bit so it's not perfect. There we go. Hit 0 to go back into the camera view. And perspective is hard, guys. Okay, let's scale it down a little bit. Alright, and now, before you deselect anything, hit Shift D to duplicate this particular bulb a couple of times. Maybe rotate it differently. Get it to attach to the wire. And basically add 2 more bulbs along the wire. And that's just to give it some nice variation. Okay, so now this is looking all right. And now we're going to get to work on the material of the bulb itself. And this is my favorite part of rendering. I love working with materials. And I'm going to show you how to use the compositor, and I'm going to try to assume that you've never used it before. I'm going to assume you've been using the materials tab to add materials, but the materials tab is simply not powerful enough to do a lot of the stuff that we want to do, and the compositor, even though it has a little bit of a learning curve, just makes everything so much easier. So we're going to dive into the compositor, but first we're going to need to be able to see what we're working with. So what I want you to do is we're going to real-time render, but only render the lamp here. So zoom in until the lamp is occupying a little bit of your screen, this bulb right here. And now hit, I believe it's Shift B, and you should get another crosshairs. And if you drag it around the lamp, you'll get this little box that stays here. The cool thing is, if you switch into rendered mode with Shift Z, it'll now only render that, and it puts much less stress on your computer. So we're going to need to do one more thing before we hop into the rendered view. We're going to need to add a sun so we can see what we're doing. So Shift A, and then add a sun under lamp and then sun, and now rotate it so that it's approximately facing the face that we want to be illuminated, like this. And hit Shift Z, and now we can see our lamp is illuminated. Okay, and to make this even clearer, go to the World tab here, and we're going to make the background black. Or not black, but very close to black. Like this. This is kind of dark gray. And now we got these much clearer shadows, and it's a lot easier to see what we're working with. Okay. Let us get to work. So, first of all, this tab over here, it's taking up too much space. Let's get rid of it. So hit T to get rid of that tab, and we're going to shrink this so that we have a little more room to work with. And now in the bottom corner here, we're going to make 2 panes. So you see these little 3 lines? Click on those and then drag them out. And now we've got 2 panes that show the same thing, but on the left pane we're going to use the compositor. So, or the node editor rather, my apologies. So click on the view change button here, the editor type, and click node editor. And now there's this big box over here that we're not going to be dealing with, so hit N to get rid of it. And now shrink this until you can basically only see the bulb, and if you want to move the bulb into the view, hit Shift and use the middle mouse click to drag it into the center. Okay. Alright, awesome. So let's start with the material of the bulb base. So that's going to be the hardest material to work with. Just because making metal realistic it can be a little difficult. So let us begin. I've included all the textures I'm going to be using in this tutorial in the description, so be sure to download those, but you can also use your own textures. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to give it a new material, and we're going to call this material metal. Alright, and now we're going to, you see we have 2 nodes here. So if you're new to the compositor, you've probably seen these nodes before, and or a node map, a really complicated looking map, and freaked out. There's nothing to worry about. It's actually a really, really simple concept. If you've taken 8th grade algebra, you can understand what's going on here. This node operates like a function. Y equals mx plus b. A function takes inputs and returns an output. In the node editor, the inputs are always on the left side of this little box here, which is called a node. You can mix and add and do all sorts of operations to nodes to make a result that is exactly what you want. So right now, this node is a diffuse node. It's essentially what happens when you go to the Materials tab and you create, new material, and it asks you for a shader, and you pick the diffuse shader. That's essentially exactly what it is, and nothing more. So there's a bunch of stuff you can input into a material, into a node, but generally, if you see each output and input has a color, and you generally want to connect the output of a node to an input of the same color, and to an input of the same color. That's a general rule. So this green works with this green, and I can connect them. If I add an image texture, this yellow connects to this yellow, so I can do that. But this alpha, this is not gray, so it wouldn't be a good idea to connect them. That's the gist of how it works. Andrew Price put it best when he said it's kind of like a sandwich making machine. Each node represents a piece of the sandwich, and you're just putting them all together until the final output, which you get, is a finished sandwich. And you can change the different ingredients, but it's all just like one big factory pipeline. And the compositor, because of this, is super, super, super powerful. So I want to show you how to make a realistic metal texture like you saw in the render at the beginning using the compositor. I'm going to try to walk you through what I'm doing. So default, it gives you, when you add a new shader, it gives you a diffuse shader and a material output. So if you click on this output here, you can connect the output into an input on the material output. Yeah, So this is an output from this node. This is an input on the material output node, and the material output node is what you see in the render. So if we change the color of this diffuse, we change the color of the object. But we don't want to do that just yet. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tell the composite, we're going to tell the node editor, we're going to tell Blender to use an image instead of a color. And the way we do this is instead of inputting a color, we input another node that takes an image as an input and outputs a color. So we can connect it to this color node. So if you hit Shift A, just like in the 3D view, and hit search, you can search for any of the nodes. And so the node we're going to be looking for is the image texture node. So if you connect the color output on the image texture node to the color input on the diffuse shader, you'll get this weird pink color. And that's because we actually haven't given it an image input yet. So let's do that. Open up your image texture and head over to your textures folder and look for the texture I'm using is a grunge texture. I'm trying to give it like a rustic feel, like the metal's been corroded a little bit. But I also want to make it like darker, and so I'm going to show you how to do that. But right now, if you notice, there is no image showing up on this thing, and that's because for a few reasons. First of all, we haven't told Blender how to map the image to the mesh. So Blender doesn't really know what a mesh looks like, and it doesn't really know what an image is. And so for us, it might be as simple as, oh, just paste it around the mesh. But Blender doesn't know how to do that, so we have to mathematically tell it how to do that. Luckily, there's a node for that. So if you hit Shift A and add a mapping node, plug it in from the vector output into the vector input, and hit Shift A again and add a texture coordinate node, these two nodes tell Blender exactly where to place the image. So normally I would UV unwrap this, which means taking all the faces of the mesh and laying them out flat. But I'm going to use generated because I found when I was experimenting that this actually worked better. So just put in generated, and now you see your image appears hideously on this light bulb base. But that's because Blender thinks this is a flat surface, when in reality, you can see that here it thinks it's flat, when in reality it's more of a box. And now we get this really, really good mapping. And already this is kind of looking pretty good, but obviously it's not looking good enough. So how else can we improve this material? So the first thing we're going to do is remember that while materials do have a texture, they also have reflection, they gloss. So hit Shift A again, and we're going to add a glossy shader. And we need to somehow mix this with the diffuse shader. And there's a node called the mix shader node that allows you to mix two shaders together. So if you hit glossy BSDF and just plug in the output from the glossy into the input on the mix shader, you can see now that it's partially reflective, but we can still also see the material. And if you play with this factor here, it changes where it's reflective. Now, materials tend to be reflective at the edges or where there's like little flecks of metal in the material. And the cool thing about this is you can get a really good effect if you tell Blender where on the material the gloss should be applied. So the way we do this is we input a black and white image where white represents reflections and black represents not reflections. And we plug this into the factor shader here. However, there's actually already a black and white image in this texture that we can just bring out. So if you hit Shift A and type RGB, you'll find this RGB to black-white node, and it converts the image texture into a black-white node. And if you take the value output of the black-white node and plug it into the factor, you can see that now the light bulb, the bulb base is only reflective on certain parts of the material, and this looks a lot more realistic. So the next thing we gotta remember is that materials have bump, and a bumpy material generally looks better than a non-bumpy material. So the way we're gonna add bump is very, very simple. I'm just gonna expand this to give myself more room to work with, and make sure there's room between the diffuse shader here and the image texture because we're gonna add a color grading node. So now hit Shift A and add a bump mapping node. It's that easy. Take the output from the RGB to black-white node, plug it into the height on the bump mapping node, and now take the normal output from the bump mapping node and plug it into the normal input on the diffuse and the normal input on the glossy. And you can see it's a little strong, so you can turn down the bump with the strength value here so you get something that looks pretty good. I like the way this looks. That looks nicely corroded. And it's as simple as that. It fakes bump mapping, and for a quick render like this one, it'll do in a pinch. Next thing we're going to add is we're going to play with the colors of this material. So if you hit Shift-A, we're going to do some color grading and type RGB, and you see something called RGB curves. And if you insert this in between the image texture and the diffuse, just by hovering over until this line that you want to insert on appears orange, and now click and it inserts it for you. We can change the color of the image by playing with these values. So we can change how much red is in the image, we can change how much blue is in the image, etc., etc. And I actually want this material to appear very dark. I want it to be almost black. So I'm going to take away a lot of the color, and now I can see that this is very glossy and reflective, which I'm not happy with. So if I turn up the roughness, or turn down the roughness, it can give it more of a wet feel, which is kind of what I'm going for. So you can play with this until you find a value you like and you think looks good. And I think around here looks interesting. Alright. And that's actually pretty much it for the first part of making the realistic texture. And if you want, you can play with the reflection color to add some mood to the scene. Mood is very important, and mood is always conveyed, pretty much always conveyed via lighting. So never underestimate the power of mood. Alright, so now we're going to go to the second half. We're going to add some wear and tear to this, this light bulb. So this top half over here was all for the metal texture, and I can actually denote that by adding what's called a frame node, placing it at the top here and expanding it. Come on. Come on. There we go. Expanding it so that it covers all of these. And if you hit N, you can see there's a label and a name. So just change the label to metal material. And you can see now this frame has now called itself metal material, and that just helps for organization. So we're going to mix this metal material with another shader, a mix shader, and we're going to give it some scratches as if it's been, through a lot. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add an image texture. Sorry, I apologize. We're going to add a diffuse shader. And plug in the diffuse shader into the mix shader, and we can see it's mixing the two shaders together. And I'm going to teach you a little trick. So if you go to File, User Preferences, and go to Add-ons again, and search for Node Wrangler, hit Check, and then Save User Settings. You now have this really neat tool where if you click on a node and hit Control-T, it will add those three nodes we added earlier. Isn't that convenient? But you just want to switch the UV tab from the texture coordinate node from UV to generated. And instead of a metal texture this time, we're going to click Open and add a scratch texture. So this will be in the description as well. But scratch textures are awesome, and we're going to see how it looks by taking the output of the diffuse and plugging it into the surface. So now this looks pretty hideous, and that's because, if you recall, we need to change this mapping from flat to box. Now that looks a little better, and what I want to make it is so that when the scratches are black, the image is transparent, so we can only essentially see the scratches. Or, if you like, you can just mix them together solidly, just like straight up mix them, and you can so if I pull this mix shader all the way down, it only shows the scratch texture. If I pull it all the way back, it only shows the metal texture. So find a balance that works for you, if you want to do it that way. I personally prefer to adjust the factor by using the color output on the image texture. So now it's only going to apply the scratch texture. Actually, you know what? Don't plug it into there. Add another mix shader, so you can duplicate this mix shader by hitting Shift-D, and then inserting it into there, and then add a transparent shader, plug it in here. Now take the output from the image texture and plug it into there, into the factor input on the mix shader, and there we go. Now, if you swap the shaders, we should be getting some very nice scratches. You can kind of see them lancing across the surface. Spend some time fiddling. I've gotten some comments mentioning that a lot of my workflow is just tweak it until it looks good. I mean, that's using Blender. the way you discover new things is by fiddling around. So don't worry if you're spending a lot of time tweaking. That's how we all. That's at least that's how I. That's how I get anything done. That's how I discover anything and learn by experimenting. So fiddle that until you got something that you like. I'm actually not very happy with this. I'm much happier with the one I made in the original render, but it just came from about 20 minutes of tweaking and playing with values until I got something that I found to be moderately acceptable. Okay, so now the next thing we're going to make is the light bulb glass texture. So right-click on the light bulb glass and make sure it's selected by looking in the Properties panel. So if you hit G and move it around, you can see if it's make sure it's selected. And so now add a new shader, call it glass. And now we have the same setup as before, diffuse and material output, but instead of using this diffuse node, we're going to use a glass shader. So hit Shift S, go to shader, and when you click on the node and hit Shift S, it'll replace it. So you see it says switch type to, and so we're going to switch the type to a glass shader. We're going to switch the type to a glass shader, and now you can see the filament. You can actually see the filament through the glass, but that's just not good enough. We need to fiddle around with the settings a bit. So first of all, you notice there's a setting here called IOR, and that's the index of refraction of the glass. So if you have ever had like a glass of water and you stick a pencil or a straw in it, have you ever noticed that it appears to be disconnected, like it's been sliced in half? That's because as light passes through a medium, the properties of the medium cause the light to bend, and that's called refraction. And how much that light bends as it's passing through is the index of refraction, and glass has an index of refraction of 1.45. If we play with the index of refraction, we can get it to be essentially it's purely glossy, and it's a lot of fun to play with indices of refraction to see what kind of cool effects you get. But we're just going to stick at 1.45 for now. And actually, I want to do something that I didn't do when I was making this originally, but I think this would help. If you right-click on the filament itself, which should be the oh, here we go. It's attached to the empty. Should be the spiral here. We're going to make it glow so we can actually see it through the glass. So hit a new shader, hit Shift S again, change the shader to emission, make a strength about 5, and make the color this like a golden color. Am I changing the filament legs? No, I'm changing the right thing. Let's see. So you want to make the filament a golden color. There we go. My battery died. Oh, okay. I've got to plug in, so just give me 1 second. There we go. Now that my battery is low or dying, we can get back to what we're doing. Okay, so just play with this until you get this kind of ruddy orange. And now we switch back to the glass shader so we can actually see what's going on. And now if you play with the index of refraction, you can see you get all these sorts of really cool effects. And that's how I made those cool like roping bits of light in the original render by playing with the index of refraction. So next thing you want to add to the scene is to this node map is Shift A and add a mix shader. We're going to mix it with a transparent shader. And this is just so that we can see the bulb a little more clearly, and you can increase the mix shader here to about 0.6, and you can see we get these really cool reflections already. And essentially the rest of this node map is going to be about bringing out those reflections. And now, I don't know if you can notice, but it's a little hard to tell where the glass ends and where the background begins. So we're going to fix this by adding another mix shader, and then adding a glossy shader. And now this is going to look hideous. But what we want to do, actually that looks pretty sick. What we want to do is add a layer weight node. So what the layer weight node does is it tells the computer to, if you use the, it tells the computer to only render part of the material at the edges of the object. So if you take the facing output from here and plug it into the factor input on the mix shader, and the glossy is going to be restricted to the edges of the lamp. And if we lower this value down to around 0.2, it still looks like glass, but now the edges are a little more clearly defined. And I'm going to actually turn up the roughness on this to about 0.5 because I don't want like glowing in the dark. And I like the way that is looking. That's looking that's looking pretty good. I like that. Okay. And remember, always just play with the values. There's a... See, I'm just finding now that if I increase this a little more, it looks a little better. And it defines the edges more clearly. Okay, so yeah, don't forget, play with values. Maybe if we switch this to Fresnel. Ooh, that looks nice. See, I just learned something new. The Fresnel apparently gives a much better result than facing. Switches back to, ooh, that's handsome. I like that glass texture very much. Okay, this is kind of great. Alright, so now that we've got these textures, and remember, play with them until you like the way they look. Now we've done all this in the node editor, and this would have been really hard to do in the materials tab. So if you have any questions, since I know this is I'm trying to gear this towards beginner and intermediate users, so if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and I'll try to answer. I hope that part of the video was well explained, because I know that the compositor can be a little bit intimidating, but if you just focus on what you need to get done, it can be a lot easier to work through, because it's such a powerful tool and it's really worth learning. Let me know in the comments below if you want a full tutorial on just how to use the compositor, but I find working with tools in Blender in the context of a full scene is more beneficial. Okay, so now that we've got this lamp, we've got to apply all these materials to the other lamps in the scene. So pull back the 3D view there, and if you click on the that bulb over there, we know that's supposed to be the glass, so give that the glass material. Do the same for the bulb far in the distance, and switch the bulb bases all to metal. And if you click on the filaments, switch that to the glowing material, which I forgot to name. And filament. And now we've got all three bulbs. Forget how to get rid of the B thing. Shift Command B. Alt B. No. Control B. No. Shift Control B. Shift Command. Okay. Let's see. So if you go to your render tab and click on this camera here and uncheck border, it gets rid of that. So, okay. Alright, now we can see that this is looking pretty neat. However, this is looking pretty good already. We want to make a few adjustments. So first of all, I want to bring the camera a lot closer to the scene. So that a little bit better, but not quite. Using the Shift F and the WASD keys as I showed you earlier. Alright, I like this a little bit better. And we also want to give the camera some depth of field. So we've got this empty here, and I'm going to rename it to DOF for depth of field. And what depth of field does is essentially allows the camera to, you know, that realistic like blurring effect you get when something's farther away versus the sharp when something's sharp when it's close. You can do that with your finger. If you look at your finger, you notice the objects in the background are all blurry, and that's just depth of field. That's focal lengths. So you can tell the camera to focus on an object, and I want it to focus on this big bulb front and center. So right-click on the camera, scroll down to depth of field, and just pick the depth of field object that we just named. And under radius here, which tells it how close it should to the object it should start applying the depth of field, change it to something big like 0.6. So now you can see this stuff in the back is really blurry. So yeah, that's looking pretty good. Actually, that's like way too blurry. I'm gonna turn that down a little bit. Okay. Okay, I can live with that. And you can see the object in the front is a lot clearer, and it looks a lot more realistic. So now we're gonna just fiddle around with stuff before we get to the render. So before we get to rendering, so click on this Worlds tab here and lower the darkness of the background even more. get it really close. There we go. And we're going to switch to using a different color grading scheme called Filmic Blender. And so under this scene data, the scene tab over here, click Open Color Management, and you can see this render view. And this has a bunch of view transforms that are essentially color grading curves, and they look like this if you use a curve. So most people like Filmic. I think you should really like fiddle around with it to see what you like. I actually like Film, and I use it a lot. Like I think that looks amazing. For some reason, less people like it. They like Filmic better, which just blows my mind because I think this looks awesome. I just think this looks a little bit less realistic, even though it shows more of the scene. But what happens is when you use the Film tab there, you have to go back to your light, and you gotta crank up the brightness because you won't be able to see anything. Alright, and I'm going to put that down to 3. So I like the way this is looking. Remember, tweak, 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 tweak. Or else, you know, you're not going to get something you're happy with. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. I might right-click on the filament here, which is a spiral, and turn up the strength to like 5. Maybe like 3. Okay. Let's make the color a little darker. Ooh, that looks nice. Why didn't I do that last night? Okay, that's looking pretty cool. Okay, so now the final thing we're going to do before we render, before I do my shameless plug for my rendering software, is we're going to add some lights in the background. So what you want to do is you want to select everything besides the sun and the so just select one of the bulbs and move it around to make sure you've selected it, and hit Shift D and pull this to the background using the arrow keys. And just, you know, scale it, make it small. We're just going to be adding some lights that hover in the background, kind of blurry. Don't worry about making it look truly random. Just do whatever feels good. And now right-click on each of the bulbs and delete them, because the bulbs are just going to add unnecessary render time. So now, if we render it, we can see we've got these lovely little lights in the background. And I think the bottom is a little lacking there, so I'm gonna move it down here. There we go. That looks pretty cool, I think. Ooh, upside down. Breaking the law. All right. Alright, so that looks nice. And now we're going to go to the render. So I don't know if throughout this video you can hear my fans turning on. That's because I'm using my laptop right now. And the reason I use my laptop is because I want to get an aspect ratio that's more closer to what YouTube uses. But regardless, I have a separate PC that I do my rendering on. And the way, instead of just copying and pasting the file over, I run it as a headless server. And so I spent a while developing a piece of software. Let's open a new terminal tab. I spent a while developing a piece of... Jesus, that's hideous. What happened to my black theme? Why? What the... Okay, there we go, much better. Okay, so I spent a while developing a piece of software that I call my cross-computer rendering GUI, and it's basically a graphical user interface that allows you to really easily send files to other computers and render them there. So I'm planning on potentially allowing other people to render on my render farm. I've let a couple friends do it as of right now, but I'm planning on letting it be available to the wider Blender community. So if you have like a weak laptop and you just want to get a render done in a reasonable amount of time, you can just use this software completely for free. So it's written in Python. I'm going to show you how it works real quick. So what you do is all the steps are right here within the software. So you create a new job, you submit the blend file you want to send over to the server, you name the output file, so I'm going to call this lightbulb tutorial, hit submit, and you can check to make sure that the information you want is available. Send the file over, and then you just hit render, and you wait. And the other computer will render it for you. And then as soon as it's done, it'll send a message back letting you know that it's finished rendering. and that might take a while, and it's done. And then you just, once it's done, it'll let you know, and you just click Get Image, and you can place it back in the folder. So just if it's in the folder you want already, just hit Choose, and it copies it over, and you can view the render. So let's see how it looks. Light bulb tutorial. So you see these purple. This purple comes from the fact that I did not pack all of the materials into the blend file. But that's all right. It's very easy to do that. Just go to File, External Data, Automatically Pack into Blend. And then when you redo it, it'll work just fine. So that's some software I'm testing. Let me know if you guys be interested in using something like that. However, I'm going to render locally because I want to use the compositor and show you guys how to use the compositor. So let's render, and I'll see you guys in a minute. Alright, and it looks like it has finished. So now we're going to work in the compositor. So on your left tab over here, hit UV Image Editor and switch to the Render Results in this little menu down here. And on this side, go back to the Node Editor. And in this tab down here, we were working in the Materials tab before, but we're going to work in the Compositing tab now. So hit Use Nodes, and you've got your Render Layers input, which is essentially the image we start with, and the compositor output. So this image is actually looking pretty good already. You notice there's a lot of this noise here. The way you fix that is by time. So go over to sampling and increase this render samples here, and that'll essentially take care of your noise. You want to maybe increase it. I believe I rendered the image that I showed you yesterday at 1,000 samples. That took a while, even on my external PC there. But anyhow, let's jump into the compositing. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add glare. So hit Shift A and then glare. And this essentially, if we turn it down to 0, it's going to add glare everywhere. It takes light sources in the image and it makes them glow. So we're going to tell it to use fog glow. And we're going to turn the threshold up a tiny bit so that it's essentially only allowing the filaments to glow. And we're going to duplicate this to make the filament glow even more. And I actually don't really like this white up here. Probably should have given that some sort of texture. In the render result, I gave it a black texture. Literally, I copied the metal texture onto that, and that worked fine. So you guys can do that too. But I've never been really good at making wires. So if you guys have any tips, and if you guys, some more advanced users watching this, if you guys have any tips on how to make wires, feel free to leave them in the comments below, because I would love to learn how to make wires better. But anyhow, so yeah, just duplicate the glare twice, and I played around with a streaks glare node and with like a high threshold. But you know, your mileage may vary. I didn't like it that much. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is color grading. And so color grading makes the scene feel warm or cold, and it can really change the mood and the atmosphere in your scene. So hit Shift A and add an RGB curves node. Some people like to use that's not it. Some people like, what is the color balance? Some people like to use the color balance node. I use RGB curves, just personal preference. But you know, you use whatever makes you comfortable. I'm going to show you how to use RGB curves. Basically, if you got these lines, you play with the value there, it'll increase the amount of that particular color in the scene. So if you want something to feel colder, give it a little more blue. See, that makes it feel a little colder. And if you want something to feel warm, give it a little more red. To me, there seems to be less red in nature, so when I find that pulling red out of the image makes it seem a little more realistic. But you do whatever you think works best. Because you're the artist, you make the decisions. I'm just showing you the general technique. And now finally, I add a little bit of jitter to the image to make it look like a little more like it was shot on film. So just add a lens distortion node. And if you notice, these are like solid pixels, so just black, orange, orange. But if you add jitter, it randomizes it a little bit more, makes it seem a little more grainy and authentic. And I like that. So that's pretty much the end of this tutorial. Hope you guys learned something. If I did something in an excessively inefficient way, let me know in the comments below. If you guys like this kind of like beginner style tutorial, like and subscribe for more. If you guys have any feedback, let me know. I'd love to hear your comments on the finished render. Yeah, so I guess that's all for today. Happy blendering, and I'll see you guys next time.